Martin, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so honoured that you agreed to come on and have a chat with me. And obviously you're in London, that's right, is it?
That is correct.
Fantastic. And you were telling me that it's a little bit of a wet day there, despite it being spring.
Well, no, at the moment it's sunny, but it's April, and April we have April showers, and this time we've been having a lot of April showers.
A lot of April showers. I remember from when I lived in England. There's a lot to talk about. I mean, first of all, I want to mention that you have just very recently released a book about the crisis between democracy and capitalism. And doesn't that subject in itself, there's part of me that feels like it's a very apt time to release a book that is entitled that, particularly after what we've been through over the last few years. Did you feel compelled to write it at this point? Was it something you had planned, or was it just a real urge really based on what we've been through?
No, actually, this book has taken a long time to finish, much longer than my previous books. And I launched the project and got the contract with the publisher in 2016. So the idea crystallized in the summer of 2016, and the main reason, though there were many others, but the main reason was the Brexit vote and the emergence of Donald Trump as the presidential candidate for the Republican Party. And these two events, though there were some other things going on in other European countries and all over the world, suggested to me that there's some profound changes in politics going on, and particularly the rise of populist politics, anti-elite, anti-institutional politics in some pretty core Western democracies. I mean, there aren't Western democracies more core than America and Britain. And so I thought I need to write a book which helped me understand why this had happened and what it might mean. Now, it's turned out to be the case that this was even more important than I thought it was, in the sense that the Trump phenomenon continues to dominate American politics, and particularly American right-of-center politics. We've had of course, the disputed 2020 election, Stop the Steal and all the rest of it. Brexit rumbled on, dividing the Conservative Party, making it extremely difficult to govern Britain sensibly, and continues to be a highly divisive issue. In Italy, of course, we now have a prime minister who is at least formally a fascist. I mean, in the strict sense, her party's fascist. It's widely expected the next president of France will be Marine Le Pen, who comes from a neo-fascist party. We clearly have radical shifts in an authoritarian direction in India, and Turkey is still on the cusp. Brazil is also on the cusp, with very even divisions between left and right-wing populism. And then, of course, we have the rise of China. And the Russia war. So the question of what is the future of democracy and how does it relate to capitalism and what form of capitalism seems to me even more important, pregnant as it were, than when I started. But it's been a long-term project, and I've had to change a bit of it as it went along. But to my surprise, the concerns I had when I started and the basic arguments of the book, which are about long-term developments mainly, has stood up pretty well.
Can we talk just a little bit before we go on into more detail about what the book is about, just about your background? Because I know you're Jewish, and obviously, you know, you were influenced by your parents and the experiences that they had. I'm Jewish myself, and Melbourne, where I'm recording this, has the highest population of Holocaust survivors per capita. So I know a lot of people themselves that have obviously come from that background and are now looking at what's going on in Europe against that background. Can you encapsulate it for people that perhaps don't have that sensitivity inside of what you're seeing from your perspective?
It so happens, as a matter of fact, that some of my closest Australian friends, including my teacher of economics at Oxford, was an Australian Jew who came from Germany. He actually came, if I remember correctly, from Breslau. and he ended up in Australia and became a very distinguished Australian economist called Max Corden. And and I have other friends with a similar background. In my own case, both representative and unrepresentative, my parents came from two different continental countries, very different. In fact, my father came from Austria. He grew up in Vienna and was very much a Central European intellectual. He was a playwright. My mother came from a small coastal town in the Netherlands where her father was a fish merchant. As I frequently marked, without the war and Hitler, there are no universe in which they would have met. It would have been inconceivable they would have ever met, given the differences in their backgrounds. But in 1937, my father, who was then unattached, decided that Germany was becoming too threatening, as indeed it proved to be, and he left for England. My mother's family left with her. She left with her parents and her brothers and sisters, actually, as the Germans were invading, the Nazis were invading the Netherlands. The fall of the Netherlands just took a few days, but they were on the coast. And so they had a few days. And my grandfather was a very remarkable man, succeeded in, the story goes, hijacking a trawler and getting to England with his family, where he survived the war. But in both cases, their wider families, my father's immediate family also survived, but their wider families, which were very large, my Dutch grandfather had 8 brothers and sisters, were all killed without exception. And well, actually, one young cousin of my father survived by miracles in Poland, and I met her after the war. So basically, I'm the product, in a very real sense, of the rise of the Nazis in Germany in the interwar period. I literally could not have existed without it, which is not which is a pretty strange thing to say. I always find that strange. But our wider families were destroyed completely. And the part of my preface explains that in my Dutch family's case in particular, they were offered the opportunity to escape with my grandfather, and they refused because they couldn't believe that what was going to happen would happen. And so the lesson I take of this, given the disasters in Europe between 1914 and 45, the 2 world wars, the interwar catastrophe, the rise of fascism and Nazism, that we should never be complacent about the stability of liberal and democratic societies. They may or may not survive, but there are impulses in human society which, if not contained, in the wrong circumstances will arise and seize control of states. It's quite easy to happen, and truly terrible things can happen.
Thank you for explaining that, because I feel that many people, we talk to people that have just released a book and it sounds very theoretical, and you read a book and you put it on the shelf and it doesn't sink in as being something that, is ever going to be taken all that seriously. But I think that what you said there regarding people didn't realize at that time what was upon them is very similar to the time that we have now with the global tensions and fractions, and it does really feel like we're heading towards war, if nothing else, and how quickly the Russia and Ukraine situation could escalate. But within that, we do have a new generation of people, and I get the question all the time, I'm sure you do, that don't really understand what capitalism is. They perhaps look around and they think this is capitalism, yet we have this big split between people that hold most of the wealth and people that don't hold much wealth, which was originally realized in 2008 when we had the 2008 financial crisis. People suddenly became aware of this, and now they're saying, well, we don't want capitalism anymore. My argument would be is actually what we have now really isn't capitalism. It's kind of a distorted form of capitalism. But I'm going to let you go on that, because obviously this is the basis of your book. What is capitalism?
Well, I know where you're coming from, and we can discuss that later. But the broadly speaking, and if you look at it historically, capitalism is an economic system which is based predominantly on a market economy, so a competitive market economy, in which private decision makers, particularly entrepreneurs, but more broadly, everybody who engaged in the economy, have freedom to set up businesses, to compete, to look for the best jobs they can get, accumulate wealth for security in old age and so forth. And so in its basis, it's a market economy with private ownership. The structure of that ownership originated essentially out of the pre-capitalist society. That was almost inevitable, and of course pre-capitalist elements remain because societies are continuous. But this sort of economy, what I describe, emerged increasingly, particularly in England and Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries, though there were some aspects of it elsewhere. And it allied, and this is a crucial element, in the late 18th and 19th and 20th century with advancing science and technology to achieve something that has simply never happened before in human history, namely continuous, sustained economic growth. And given the magic of compound interest, this means that standards of living today, which is something people take for granted, including the people who say, well, if this is capitalism, I don't like it, but they take for granted all the truly extraordinary transformations of our economy and our society on multiple dimensions that are the product of this revolutionary force of the market economy interacting with science and technology. And so that is how I would define capitalism. Of course, Marx had a narrower definition. He focused just on the ownership of the means of production. It's an important dimension, but I think it's something much broader and more creative than that.
You mentioned, where I'm coming from. I think it's really because of that last comment I made about what we have around us at the moment really has been a distortion of that. Because how has it been that in a market economy, which should increase competition and benefit consumers, has become an economy which doesn't do that? And I am pointing you in a sort of direction, because I reached out to you after reading an excellent article that you had written on land taxation. And obviously within the context of that article, you were very aware of the history of land taxation and Henry George and Thomas Paine and the classical writers that advocated that. And within that article, you explained how capital has been even mistreated, the language of capitalism being mistreated in the universities, so that capital now, when we talk about land price inflation, for example, we say capital growth, but it's not capital growth, is it? Because capital is distinct, it's man-made items. Can you explain a bit about that? Because I feel it's really important that people that are listening to you hear that simple message so that they can understand what's going on in the economy and how to vote when it comes to that.
Well, so my view is that what we have is still capitalism, but what we're really discussing here is the structure of ownership, what can be owned, and therefore how the benefits of economic growth are divided. Now, I'll come to that in a second. I think it's still crucial to recognize that, if you take any standard analysis of the benefits to consumers over a lengthy period, it's pretty clear that the real incomes of consumers, which is the vast majority of people in rich countries like Australia or Britain, are just inconceivably higher than they were 150 years ago. It is important to remember, basically, the best estimates we have are that in the early 19th century, when, by the way, life expectancy in Britain was about 30, not as it is now, nearly 80. Well, it's actually basically 80. The 80 or 90% of the population were on the margins of subsistence. That's basically, and the vast bulk of their income inevitably went on food and clothing. So they had no means of fast travel. They didn't have gadgets in their home that sorted out really important things like cooking and washing and all the rest of it. So it was back-breaking labor doing things that to us are simply inconceivable. If you look at how, for example, housewives used to work in the 19th centuries, and why they needed so many servants, and there were so many servants, again, something that's largely disappeared. So the transformation is profound. I tend to think of all these transformations, the most profound is in life expectancy, because we know that in human societies, life expectancy was pretty low throughout sort of history of agrarian societies, somewhere between around 30, because the main reason for that is something like 300 children, sometimes more, per 1,000 children, babies died as children. I just think of that. This is all completely transformed. I sometimes think the most miraculous things that have happened to us in completely different areas, everything that electricity has generated, another of these huge seismic technological revolutions, and without which we would not have electric light and we would not be having these conversations. So I think we have to accept, if you explain to somebody in 1850 that we were having Zoom calls, he or she would have said, well, that's magic, isn't it? And somebody very brilliant once said, technology can be defined as the things that people used to think of as magic. No, so we have had magical transformations. And I think one of the most worrying things is that people sort of take for granted everything they had since they were a child. And if you're relatively young, that means the last 20 or 30 years. But those things that you see around us, everything, the cities, everything, didn't exist in this way 200 years ago. And they should remember that. Now, coming to your point, this is, I think, mainly to do, to my mind, with history. And that's where the classical economists are so interesting. It's very, very important to remember that most organized societies, and certainly the societies in which the Industrial Revolution happened, where people like Paine, the sort of society in which people like Paine and Adam Smith and Ricardo and Henry George were writing, these originally came out of feudalism. The societies that and indeed pre-feudal societies, and the great characteristic of all these societies, and I discuss this briefly in my book, is that the basis of wealth was the ownership of land. Land was overwhelmingly the most important productive factor, and agriculture was the main activity for obvious reasons. Comes back to what I said, feeding oneself was the dominant concern of people. And to be wealthy was to own land, and if you owned land, you owned the rent of land, which David Ricardo became very famous for defining what that meant. And you could become very rich on the rent of land, and you could get this either by controlling the labor force directly, as in serfdom, or controlling it through tenant farming, as it happened in England, as the farming system evolved. Tenant farmers paid you the rent, which was the value of land over and above the value of their efforts and the capital that they invested in their farm. and security of tenure, because it became very important. This was progress. It was early capitalism, actually, that sort of commercial relationship between the landowner, who had previously been a feudal lord, and the tenant farmer. But the rent of land went to what some writers in the 19th century in England, like Richard Cobden, called the free trader, called the land monopolists, right? And in British politics in particular, the land monopolists, namely the territorial magnates, were dominantly powerful, and they controlled the House of Lords, which was one of the two. That's why they were there. Now, but this is true in all over Europe. I mean, indeed, basically everywhere. The landowning elite were the core elite of society. So as one of the ways the landowners became, were willing to accept, not all of them did, by the way, the rise of the commercial classes, the rise of the wealth generated by capitalists, in the narrow sense, people who are building their wealth on productive capital, on produced goods, which is what where the capitalists distinguished themselves from the old aristocrats. They were creating something. They weren't just parasites living off the efforts of others. So I've always been on the side of the capitalists as against the landowners. But the landowners accepted this because they discovered, there were many reasons. First of all, the capitalists got very, very rich, and they had very rich daughters, and they liked marrying their sons off to them. This is not trivial. It's part of 19th century literature. But more profoundly, they discovered that as the country got more productive, their land got more valuable. And now, it wasn't simple. That's why free trade was such a huge issue in Britain, because Britain didn't have a comparative advantage in producing food, and they could import it more freely, more cheaply from the New World. And so there was a huge battle over free trade, which was a class war. It was seen as a class war. But the aristocrats were strong enough to retain control over land. And as countries got richer, their land got more valuable. And that was particularly true if the land they owned was in cities. So the richest English person today, English, the person is the Duke of Westminster. And the reason he's so rich is that he's descended from people who, as a result of marriage mainly in the 17th century, owned a huge chunk of London called Mayfair. And that's created the land owning class. And then finally, we did something even cleverer, or worse from our point of view, which is we turned most of the new rising middle classes into urban landowners, because the most valuable land in our societies, as we moved away from a predominantly agricultural economy, ceased to be farmland. Farmland is not really, in most Western countries, that important a source of wealth. But what really is valuable is urban land, and land near great conurbations, which has value because of the immense wealth, staggering wealth generated by the productive cities of the modern world as a result of capitalism. And the land wealth, some of it went, of course, as we've mentioned, to people who happened to have inherited it before, and or were very clever about where they bought it. They became very rich in that way. Think of Donald Trump's family, or everybody who wanted to become an owner-occupier, like he, who wanted to own their own house, ended up owning a little bit of London. And London is so rich that owning a little bit of London, like me, and it really is a little bit of London, makes you a millionaire, just like that. So we ended up quite naturally, without really thinking about it, because of the private ownership of land and the feudal origins of all this, with a society in which land ownership and access to land, which is, by the way, the dominant cost of housing. When we think about the high prices of housing in Sydney or anywhere else, London, this is the price of land. It's the price of location. It's not the buildings. The buildings are usually quite cheap compared to the price of land. So we've all become landowners. And the problem with that is, as you say, that means that nobody wants to tax it because there are just so many interests involved in continuing to own land rents. Land rents have been, to a significant degree, spread quite widely across our society, not evenly, but really very widely. It's one of the most interesting consequences of Thomas Piketty's controversial work, but one of the most interesting bits of it is that it shows how important urban land has become as a source of wealth. So that is where we are, and it has one final consequence, which is, in order to fund our governments, and we want to fund our governments, because we have lots of services we want, and rightly so, and because land is such an important asset, and it is owned so widely, landowners don't want it to be taxed, and land rents are very lightly taxed. They are privately owned. In owner-occupied housing, land rent isn't taxed at all because the implicit rent isn't taxed. The urban land generally is colossally undertaxed in most societies. So we tax other things, and basically what we tax is savings and enterprise and effort. And that's quite a large distortion. It all goes back to where we came from. Where I think this is a very important point where we might disagree. I understand that societies don't willingly overturn the basis of property, which seems sort of natural to them, which has evolved in the way I describe it over centuries. And while there's an immensely rational case for taxing land more because there can't be less of it because it's there, and transferring the social value of rent to society as the basis for taxation and reducing taxation on everything else, we'd clearly be better off as a result in aggregate, but the distributional consequences are such that people will fight to the death to prevent it. So I've thought about that, and there are ways around it, but they are very difficult. Long answer, big question.
Yeah, thank you. That was such an excellent synopsis of the history of where we are and why we're here. And of course, you're absolutely right. Our standard of living and our living conditions are far superior to where they were. But of course, you know, in our technological devices that we have around us are also a form of land, if you like, because land in economics obviously includes the electromagnetosphere, and you know, and what happens with the technologies is they may be cheap for us, but of course behind them sit these great monopoly platforms that have also created monopolies from the social character of society, which is how land has generated its wealth. I suppose where I'm pushing to with this, particularly in the context of your book, is that if you look back in the history of England, even to Winston Churchill, who himself was in favor of land taxation, and in 1909 tried to put forward his land tax bill where he shifted more of the tax base onto land and wanted it shifted off productivity and labor, which is what both of us would obviously advocate. And it was overturned in the House of Lords, and it took a while for land taxation to, that bill to be implemented in any form in England. But the problem is that even though we are all landowners in a sense, and we all sort of sit on this parasitic system and we benefit from it, it affects democracy. We don't really have democracy because the elite or the big landowners are never going to allow the system to change outside of their favor. So the financiers that sit at the top of the pyramid are certainly want to reap the gains. They're not going to allow things to change. So when we do have a financial downturn, it's the financiers that are bailed out and the taxpayers that take the hit. So wouldn't you agree that that's kind of where there is a natural separation between capitalism and democracy?